The ideas expressed in City Club forums are those of the speakers and not of the City Club of Cleveland, IdeaStream Public Media, or their sponsors. Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream Public Media are made possible by PNC and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.
Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland, where we are devoted to creating conversations of consequence that help democracy thrive. Today is Thursday, May 8th. My name is Dan Moulthrop. I'm the Chief Executive here, and I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today. He's an author. He's the former U.S. Secretary of Commerce. He's a titan of business, Wilbur Ross. Before becoming Commerce Secretary, Wilbur Ross earned a reputation as one of the nation's most hard-nosed negotiators and a so-called king of bankruptcy over his 55-year career on Wall Street. This reputation in part landed him among Bloomberg's 50 most influential people in global finance and his role in the first Trump administration. Secretary Ross faced a number of tough challenges during his tenure there, but he survived in his post all 4 years, one of just a small number of cabinet secretaries to do so in that term. The Secretary oversaw the negotiation and implementation of tariffs on China and elsewhere, and undoubtedly, there are few others with this kind of deep insight into the mind of President Trump, the President's motives on tariffs, taxes, and deregulation policies. In his latest book, Risks and Returns, Creating Success in Business and Life, Ross explains how he got to the top and how he stayed at the top. This book serves as a candid reflection of a life lived at the pinnacle of Wall Street, New York, and Palm Beach society, and the Trump administration. We're delighted that our moderator today is Greg Lawson. Greg is a research fellow at the Buckeye Institute and a great friend of the City Clubs. With nearly 20 years of experience, he brings expertise in Ohio's budget, local government, taxation, and federal issues as well. If you have a question for Secretary Ross, you can text it to 330-541-5794. And City Club staff will work it into the Q&A portion in the second half of the program. Members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross and Greg Lawson of Buckeye.
Well, thank you very much. Honored to be up here on stage with such a titan who's had a front row seat to history. And actually, we were just talking back in the green room a little bit about your connections here to Cleveland and some of your very early challenges that you were doing with your own company. So would you care to go into a little bit about that experience?
You know, when I bought my business from the Rothschild family, the first deal I made after coming out of their orbit was LTV Steel here in Cleveland. LTV, as some of you may recall, had gone bankrupt twice. The first time around, I was an advisor to the creditors. Second time around, we bought LTV. And what made it unique was it had been on what's called hot idle, meaning there was just a little driblet of molten metal going through the furnaces so that the refractory bricks wouldn't implode. Nobody had ever turned one back on, so that was a pretty big risk that we took. But we hired a wonderful manager called Rodney Mott, who came from Nucor, and what made the deal work was when we were getting ready to bid. Rodney and I went and met with Leo Gerard, who then was the president of the steelworkers. And we said, Leo, we'll open the mill again. We'll hire the thousands of people back. We won't cut anybody's pay or any of that. But we need a non-compliant contract. We need relief from some of the feather bedding. And it worked. So we went to an Italian restaurant on the big slope outside Pittsburgh, and over a gallon or so of red wine, we worked out the deal. And it cut 32 job descriptions down to 5. For those of you who don't deal with unions, a job description is all that the person does. And in the case of LTV, where they were very restrictive, more or less said, you can only pick up a red shovel and she can only pick up a white shovel. There's a lot of unnecessary rules. So we took 32 down to 5, and we made a few other changes as well. We had backing from Cleveland Cliffs, and we made a deal with Cliffs that was before they were steel makers. They were then just producing ore. And we made a deal with them that instead of a fixed price for our raw material, it would be a certain percentage of whatever price we were getting for hot rolled sheet. So we made what would have been a fixed cost into a variable, and with the increase in productivity, we took the number of man hours it took to make a ton down from 6 to 1.5. So we became very, very competitive, and then went on and bought Bethlehem and Whirling Pittsburgh and some others, and then ultimately merged it into Mattel, an Indian entrepreneur who had done in emerging markets much the same as what we had done here. So it was a very exciting time, and I was quite a regular commuter to Cleveland in those days. But I never got to know downtown very well because we didn't have a big fancy headquarters. Our headquarters was right over the mill. So we kind of hung around out there. So as a result, I never got to see this wonderful club until today.
So, some of your earliest experiences as you were kind of learning the ropes in the world of finance, could you kind of explain a little bit about, I guess, first of all, what got you interested in it, and then some of the earliest lessons before you ended up sort of rolling out and doing things on your own?
Well, when I went to Yale undergraduate, and my dream was to be a creative writer, a fiction writer, but Yale had a very strenuous course for potential writers. It was called Daily Themes. Every day, 5 days a week, you had to put at least 1,000 words of prose in a little mail slot by 10 o'clock in the morning. Well, by the end of the second week, I was out of material, so I quit the course, and instead, a faculty member from Yale, who was actually very involved with managing their portfolio, took a liking to me. He was leaving the university to become a partner in an investment firm in New York, and he very nicely took me along to be his clerk. So that's what really started it. But my first real job in Wall Street was just after I graduated from Yale in the summer before I went to Harvard Business School. I was a trainee at the old J.P. Morgan, and that was quite an amazing institution. It continued a lot of the traditions that the elder Mr. Morgan had had when he put it together. They still had mahogany roll-top desks and brass spittoons for the senior officers. Now, in the 1990s, not so many people smoked a cigar in the office and spit in a brass spittoon, but it was symbolic. And they also had a tradition. They had an enormous safe right in the ground floor at 23 Wall, which was our address, the corner of Wall and Broad. And they always left the safe door open It was as much as if to say, no robber would ever dare to come in and try to hold up J.P. Morgan, and none did. But they also had some other very good traditions. And just during the beginning of that summer, they were taking over Guarantee Trust Company, which was a much bigger bank, but didn't have the panache that JP had. So they were drilling us every day before we left, saying, you must not give up the Morgan tradition. And Guarantee was so big, they had more officers than we had employees. So there was a whole difference in scale. But Morgan people were very specific type, and even to the secretaries. The secretaries were all from the Seven Sister schools. Then they wore little cashmere sweaters and a white string of pearls and carried a Wall Street Journal to work each morning. So you could pick them out. It was not your typical secretary. So the first morning when I was transferred to the trust department at the old Guarantee, we're going up in the elevator, and a Guarantee secretary said to the Morgan girl, well, tell me, dear, how do you think you'll like it working here at 140 Broadway? The Morgan girl instantly replied, how would you feel if you were working at Tiffany's and you were transferred to Woolworths? Silence in the elevator all the way up. But a little bit later that summer, they finally let me go and represent the bank at a closing. And it was a closing that was amazing in and of itself and had a lot to do with my later life. It was to pick up a 13th mortgage that some Morgan client had just acquired. It was a mortgage issued by William Zeckendorf Sr., famous real estate speculator. And at the time, I couldn't visualize a 13th mortgage. I couldn't even visualize a 10th or 11th. But it turned out there were two mortgages even below ours, a 14th and a 15th. So I'm there. I got there for the closing about a half hour early, got myself all shined up and pressed and everything. And it was an amazing office. Zeckendorf had developed a lot of the properties around the UN. And this was a penthouse office, a totally circular room with floor-to-ceiling glass windows. So you had the most breathtaking panoramic view of New York City. So I was standing there with my tongue hanging out. Then this great big bear of a man came up to me holding a little Chihuahua dog, and he put his arm on my shoulder, and in a very hoarse whisper, he said, "What's the matter, young fellow? You look a little troubled." I said, "Oh, no, sir. It's just I've never seen a circular office." And he bent over a little further toward me and said, "Let me tell you, Sonny, if you have been backed into an effing corner as many times as I had, you'd have a goddamn round office, too." So it was fascinating, and it actually saved me a lot of money later, because 18 months later, he went bust, including our 13th mortgage for our client. And so when the subprime mortgage situation came up, I never got lured in, because I figured all they were doing was the same thing Zeckendorf had been doing, slicing and dicing the mortgage so they could put too much mortgage on the property. But since I also remembered that he went bust with it, I never bought any of the paper until after it had collapsed. And we actually made a partnership with the U.S. Treasury. This was when Tim Geithner was the Treasury Secretary, and they put up half the money and we put up half, but most of theirs was a zero coupon loan to us, and then the deal was we would split the profits. And we ended up giving them way over $1 billion profit, which at the time I thought was a lot. And later when I got to Wall Street, I found out it wasn't much. It was a little bit of a day's work.
Well, one thing that was very interesting to me was that you had a little bit of an experience with a very famous artist, or at least you had lived in the same area as one John Lennon.
Yes.
What do you recollect from the time period then?
Well, this was a cooperative building in New York called the Dakota, and I was actually the president of the board the night when Lennon was shot, which was the most horrible experience you can imagine. Dakota, unlike most New York buildings, is like a little community, and everybody knew each other, and we even had what amounted to a courtyard party the first Wednesday in October. Each family, including the Lennons, would bring their favorite food, and it would be kind of a community sharing. The Lennons always brought macrobiotic food, which was not a big seller except to my daughters. They loved the idea of macrobiotic food. But he was a lovely, gentle man, very much participated with everybody else in the building in a lot of traditions. Leonard Bernstein was also living in the building, and one of our traditions was we had four quadrants, and the Brooklyn Children's Choir would come and sing Christmas carols, and then we would all go to Bernstein's apartment, and these kids were in heaven. They were little poor children from Brooklyn, and here they are Christmas caroling to Leonard Bernstein playing music just for them. So it was that kind of a building, and Lennon fit very, very well into it. Well, after the shooting, it became even more of a nightmare. The police came, and they knew that there would be people coming to mourn in big, big quantities. So they put up barricades. Everybody living in the building had to get a photo ID card, and no workmen were allowed in, no anything, until the crowds went away. And the crowds kept getting bigger and bigger, and after the first few days, the Save the Whale people were there, the Kill the Whale people were there. Everybody was there because the TV cameras were there all day, so every group. Well, after this went on for some weeks, we figured, how are we going to make a cathartic event so these people won't keep blocking our building? And one of my fellow directors knew David Geffen, and David Geffen was great friends with Yoko Ono. So he went to Yoko and he explained our problem, and he said, Yoko, you and John always liked this one little area in Central Park, and maybe you should have a final ceremony there, and that would let everybody know that it was finished. They should go home. They shouldn't just keep coming to the building. So she did that. But she stayed living in the building with their son for years after it. So it was quite an extraordinary experience.
Well, so switching gears a little bit here, what was your first time meeting Donald Trump? And how do you think that kind of played into what eventually led to becoming a cabinet secretary in his first administration?
Well, it did. It certainly did. As has been mentioned, for quite a few years, I was mainly dealing in distressed companies, initially as an advisor and then later on as a principal. And the way I met Donald Trump was in 1990. He had decided to build a casino in Atlantic City right on the boardwalk called the Trump Taj Mahal. The only problem was it never made one interest payment. It defaulted before the first payment came due. So the Thursday before Memorial Day weekend, the bondholders hired me to try to get their money back. The bonds at that point were trading at 20 cents on the dollar, so it was pretty horrible. There were $800 million worth of them, and so my clients had, on paper, lost $600 million in just a few months. So when Trump heard I'd been hired, he called and he said, "Wilbur, you have to come down to Atlantic City tomorrow, and we'll start talking." Well, the last thing I wanted to do was spend Memorial Day weekend in Atlantic City with tens of thousands of people playing slot machines. But I went down, and it was easy to do. He had his big helicopter at the airport in New York, and it was easy to pick it out because in nail polish red, 6-foot-tall letters, TRUMP. So we get down to Atlantic City about 40 minutes after flying, and Trump is there in a big stretch limo. And I noticed as I got into the car, there were 2 flags on the front bumper. One was a US flag, and the other was a Trump flag. And the Trump flag was a little bit bigger than the US flag. So that was the sign of his gift for understatement of things. Anyhow, so it's a mob with people, they're screaming and yelling, "Donald, Donald." He was like a cult hero. So we get into the casino, and it's more of the same. People having him sign their beanie hat, sign their notepad. One lady had on a bareback dress. She had him sign her back. I don't know what she was going to do with Donald J. Trump and magic marker on her back, but that's what she wanted. So we go upstairs and we start dickering, except we're getting no place. Trump announced that, as I knew, the bonds were at 20 cents, and he said, "And your holders will be lucky if at the end of the whole thing they get 20 cents. So I'll tell you what, let's not bother fighting about it. I'll personally guarantee the 20 cents, then we can part as friends." I said, "Well, Donald, the only problem is the holders want me to get them 100 cents plus their accrued interest plus some stock in the casino. And as a result, we have a little value gap that we have to talk about." A couple hours went by. I got no place, absolutely not one bit of budge. So I finally said, "Well, Donald, is this it? As far as today is concerned, you're not going to go beyond 20 cents. He said, "Yes, that's right, 20 cents. So I said, "Well, then I'm not going to waste my weekend here." And I walked out on him. And that shocked him because that was the kind of tactic he was used to using on other people. So it was a little bit of corporate jujitsu to have someone walk out on him. We then began very public bickering with a lot of mean things said back and forth. And that's when I learned Trump likes to do everything in the public domain. Then he's a genius at dominating news cycles, as we've all come to learn in later years. And finally, one morning in October, we were very, very close to getting what my clients wanted and needed. So I went over to his office in the morning. I said, "Donald, this is our best and final offer. And if we don't make a deal today, we're going to file an involuntary bankruptcy petition, and tomorrow morning, your Taj Mahal is going to be in bankruptcy. Well, he turned the proposal down. So I went back to my office and I put out a press release. And the press release said the Trump Taj Mahal bondholders are going to have a very important press conference at 5 o'clock at the Marriott Marquis. We picked the Marriott Marquis because it wasn't one of his properties. We figured that would twit him a little. So as soon as it came on the news ticker, he called me and he said, Wilbur, what the hell is this? What are you doing at the Marriott Marquis? What are you going to say to them? I said, well, Donald, I told you if we don't make a deal today, we're going to put you in Chapter 11. That then triggered final negotiation, and we made the deal, and we got what we needed. And then he said, but one more thing. And I had gotten to know him well enough to know when he said something like, one more thing, it was usually a real zinger. This time, the one more thing was you have to move the press conference from the Marriott Marquis to the Plaza Hotel, because the Plaza was one of his properties. So we made the deal, we had the press conference, and as you can imagine, I was pretty worn out. Even by my standards, this was a pretty trying day. So I'm in the limo being driven home, and suddenly the phone rings. This is your mother. Oh, hi, Mom. Everything okay? No, everything is decidedly not okay. Oh, what's wrong? Well, my girlfriends and I have been here playing mahjong while we were watching that disgraceful press conference you had with Trump. And we all feel that after those mean things he had said publicly about you, you should not have made a deal with him. I said, well, but Mom, that's what I do. That's how I make my living. And she said, well, if you would only become a lawyer like I always wanted you to, you wouldn't have to hang around with people like that. And she hung up on me. A few weeks later, she forgave me for the Trump part, but to her dying day, she never forgave me for not being a lawyer. So that was my reward.
Well, so I know we're getting close to time for some Q&As, but there was an interesting story that I know you had mentioned from your time when you were the secretary, and it kind of really ties into things that are getting ready to happen right now. We have apparently the outline of an agreement with England right now and some of the current tariff issues. That was announced earlier this morning. But in particular, you were talking about a Mar-a-Lago meeting between the leader of China, Xi Jinping,
Yes.
and President Trump, I think in 2017. And given that there are supposed to be negotiations beginning, I believe in Switzerland here in the subsequent week or so, I'm curious what you witnessed in terms of how that relationship was moving and the scale of the challenges of negotiating with China.
Well, the meeting with Xi was the first big official meeting that Trump took since he became president. And it was scheduled to start with a big ceremonial dinner at Mar-a-Lago, his wonderful estate in Palm Beach, the old Meriwether Post estate. But at about 2 o'clock that afternoon, I got a call at my house in Palm Beach saying there was an emergency meeting of the National Security Council at Mar-a-Lago. He had put me on the National Security Council in addition to the commerce job. So I went over there, and when you look at the book, their books here, you'll see we're all crowded in this little tiny windowless room, very safe from people spying. And that's where the decision was made to launch the 52 missiles into Syria in retaliation for their attacking one of our air bases in the Mideast. And at that meeting, Trump made I think, the most important foreign affairs decision of his whole administration, even though the press never really picked up on it. What he decided was not to delay the announcement about the missiles until after we had finished the conference, two-day conference with Xi, but instead to announce it right smack in the middle of the ceremonial dinner. 7:15 is what he picked out as the time to announce it. And the reason I think that was so important was, what was he doing? He was sending a message not just to Iran, not just to the Syrians, but to Xi and to other world leaders. Push me too far, and you're going to get a response that you won't be very happy with. And I think it's why during the first administration, Russia didn't invade anybody, Iran was fairly quiescent, even North Korea didn't make much trouble. The world was calm. And I think the reason was they were a little bit afraid of Trump. They felt he was not a predictable president, but they saw what he did in retaliation to Syria. Syria only launched a few missiles and nobody was killed. A few Americans were wounded. So for him to launch 52 missiles at 52 different targets was an overreaction and a deliberate one to tell them more to come if you keep screwing around. So I really think that was important. But we get to the dinner, and another very important thing then developed. President Xi was giving us a lecture on his vision of what the history of China had been. And he just got through talking about the mean things that the colonial powers had done to China when they had control of it. And an aide came up to President Trump with a little note. Well, I knew what was in the note because it was 7:15, and the note was going to say we had launched the missiles. So Trump interrupted Xi and said, Mr. President, I don't mean to interrupt, but something very important has just happened, and I know your intelligence will pick it up quickly, but I wanted you to hear it directly from me. And he told him we had launched the 52 missiles. Well, Xi, who had been talking through an interpreter the whole day, suddenly said in perfect English, please repeat. That was the first clue we had that he spoke English. And the translator did repeat it to him, and then he said back through the translator, well, President Trump, I guess he had a busy afternoon. And that was it. He never mentioned it again that evening or the whole conference. So we began to learn a little bit about what a tough cookie Xi was. He didn't blink. You can imagine this was pretty startling news to hear that he had done that. The guy didn't bat an eye. So it gave us an inkling of what was to come subsequently in dealing with him.
Put some things into context for some of the upcoming discussions, I would imagine. So I think it's about time to begin our Q&A session. So we're about to begin it. Again, for the live stream audience, I'm Greg Lawson, Research Fellow at the Buckeye Institute, moderator for today's conversation. And of course, today we are joined by former U.S. Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross. We're talking about tariffs, the economy, his new book, Risks and Returns, Creating Success in Business and Life. We welcome questions for everyone, City Club members, guests, as well as those that are joining us live stream at cityclub.org. And so if you would like to text a question for the Secretary, please text it to the following number, 330-541-5794, and City Club staff will try to work it into the program. So can we go ahead and have our first question?
Hi, Mr. Secretary. My question is in regards to with Joe Biden, we saw a lot of subsidies through the CHIPS Act and the IRA. This time with President Trump, we're seeing a lot of trade action, but not a lot of subsidies, and it's kind of a whiplash. Do you think this is advantageous because it gives different kind of strategies, or do you think this whiplash is kind of why we're behind maybe China when it comes to moving in a cohesive direction?
So it was about Biden and the industrial policy he was doing versus our trade. And so is that making it hard for us to be cohesive?
Well, I think, first of all, you have to look at his tariff policy in a historical perspective. You probably aren't aware, but U.S. traditionally had run huge trade surpluses right until the early 70s. We had trade surpluses every year. And in fact, in the early days of the Republic, tariffs were the main source of revenue for the U.S. government. But the government's policy after the war was to give trade concessions to Europe and to Asia to help them get back on their feet. But the problem was they didn't time limit it. So we are giving now the same concessions to China and to Germany and to everybody else that we did in 1947, even though the war is long since behind and they've long since become powerful nations. So the prior governments actually locked in those commitments through the World Trade Organization and before that GATT. Meanwhile, President Clinton let China into the WTO, and that might have been a good idea, but not the way he did it. What he did it was he assumed that China would live by the rules once they were a member, but he didn't have any enforcement mechanism in case they didn't live by the rules, and they have not. So we've had a real problem there. And I'll give you an example of some of the crazy anomalies. It costs 4 times as much to send an airmail package from the US to China than it does from China to the US, because we agreed to give them bargain rates. But it costs the same to move the package whichever the direction. So that was a direct subsidy. He put in a rule. We had a rule called the de minimis. Anything that was self-declared to be under $800 in value came in tariff-free, and more importantly, was not inspected by customs. Now, it was up to a 10-kilo package. Well, you can put a lot of bad things in a 10-kilo package, including bad substances. Trump is now did away with that exception, and there are literally millions and millions of packages, mostly from China, that came in under $800, paying no tariff whatsoever. And I could go on and on and on and on. They subsidized everything. They made huge rebates to the aluminum companies, huge rebates to the steel companies to make them more competitive, because they weren't so interested in making a profit. They were interested in creating jobs for their people, and exporting product was a big way to do that. So there are terrible trade imbalances that we are now trying to get rid of. And this announcement about UK is useful, but our trade balance with UK is very close to break even anyway. But it's a good symbol, and it's especially a good message to the EU, because UK had broken away from EU. My best guess is that the next few will very likely include India, probably Vietnam, maybe Japan, and then perhaps Canada and Mexico. I think he will probably keep isolating, and India will be an early one. I think he'll keep isolating China because they're going to be the toughest one to deal with.
Another question
Yes,
over here.
thank you for coming today. You're a great storyteller. It's been really fascinating. So today, your Trump administration successor, Secretary Ludnick, said that regarding the EU agreement, that it would have taken them 3 years to come to this agreement, and he credited Trump to getting this done in, I don't know, a week or 2 weeks or something. You've already talked about his great negotiating skills. Could you just elaborate on that a little bit more and how he's able to accomplish all of these?
Well, when I was negotiating with the EU in the first Trump, one of our big complaints was that they will not allow many American agricultural products to be brought in. It's not even a question of tariffs. They simply will not permit them. GMO-enhanced foods are one of the examples. So I asked their trade negotiator, said, well, why? What's the rationale for preventing GMO-enhanced foods? And she said, well, we view that Europeans think it's a health problem, so they would never buy the food. I said, well, why don't we do this? If you're right that Europeans won't buy it, let us put it on the shelves, and if you're correct and it doesn't sell, our companies will very quickly stop trying to sell it. No answer, no response. And they have lots of rules like that. They had a rule at one point that certain cars couldn't come in because the seat belts weren't effective. And we said, seat belts? What do you mean they're not effective? And they said, well, your seat belts are very good at high-speed crashes. Ours are very good at low-speed crashes. Kinds of things like that that make no sense, kind of junk science. So they will be tough, and they'll be tough for a couple of reasons. One, Europe is having big economic problems of its own right now, just as China is. Second, Europe isn't really one coherent entity. It's 27 countries, every one of which must approve big decisions. Well, each one has different issues. With France, it's wine and other kinds of beverages. With the UK, it's fish, it's cattle, it's this, it's that. So for them to get together and really decide what concessions to make, this is back when England was part of the EU, for them to get together and decide what concessions, hard, very hard for them to do. It's just structurally difficult. And second, they've been used to being spoiled. They've been used to getting away with murder. And when we would take a case to the WTO, even though the WTO rules said any dispute had to be adjudicated within 90 days, but when it came to Boeing complaining about Airbus's subsidies, case went on for 17 years, a 90-day limit, but 17 years it went on. So I think that's going to be much harder with the EU.
But that would be why President Trump kind of takes the more aggressive response on the front end to
Yeah.
try to compel, break down those barriers.
The other thing that was strange, when we put on the steel and aluminum tariffs, which were the first ones we did, we couldn't get the EU to put on similar tariffs on steel and aluminum coming into Europe, because we tried to explain to them what's going to happen now that we have a big tariff on China. They're going to start shipping steel into you, and they wouldn't believe that, and it's what happened, and it wrecked their steel industry. So they're tough to deal with, and they've been used to doing things their own way.
I think we have another question here.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for your comments for our distinguished guests and coming all the way. Just for the record, I met Mr. Wilbur when he was a Commerce Secretary at Mar-a-Lago. And it was astonishing because I asked him about some commerce question, and the first thing he did is gave me his personal cell phone and email. I remember Lisa was one of the SB, I don't know if you remember that or not, the head of it. So thank you for your humbleness. And then I asked you to come in, as you know, I'm from Pakistan, and Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, who you invited for trade discussions, and we had a dinner in New York. So thank you for that. My question is, because I have a twofold question. One, about the tariffs. We discussed that in Palm Beach and today in the car, that China is retaliating the first time, as far as we know. I've been dealing with China in our businesses a little bit. We export close to 400 million in trade with China, but the world is in billions and trillions. And this is the first time we noticed that the scale of taking the production out of China, either we take it out to Taiwan or Vietnam, like you mentioned, or Pakistan or India, wherever. It's a very difficult thing, and we can't bring it back because of the raw material all the way back in US. So even though we are negotiating and they're retaliating, and the companies who are suffering, as well as the economy here, I mean, we just wiped out $6 trillion in our stock market. So what is your advice more from the DC and for businesses to tackle, and what do you think the outcome is going to be for that? The second thing, just a twofold question, even though I wasn't going to ask you that. As you know, that we have been discussing between India and Pakistan a war or escalating war, if you will, and it's a concern for civilians. One country can say that there are terrorists in other part of the world and they can go attack over the border, which, as you know, it's not allowed in the UN or anywhere you look at. But the idea is to bring peace, and US was always up front trying to do that. And right now, India is mad and they're just escalating the situation. I know there's been a dispute, a long dispute in countries since 1947. But how do we really diffuse the situation, looking at from your advice from US point of view? Thank you.
So how do you deal with the escalating situation we've got going on in Pakistan? How do we deal with the escalating situation with India and Pakistan in terms of how does America engage in that?
The escalation of tariffs?
Well, the escalation of the military situation, and then also the question of how do companies navigate some of this situation with limitations on being able to bring certain raw materials back into the U.S. And some of the trade negotiations. So it's like a two-part question.
Well, if what really comes out of this is the concept of reciprocity, it will likely be reciprocity both up, which is what we're doing now with tariffs, and down. And it could very well be that the end result, once countries know what they need to do, end result could very well be lower tariffs all over the world, because while Trump likes tariffs in part as a means of raising cash without raising taxes, the real objective is to get rid of our big trade deficit to the degree that we can. So India, for example, is already volunteering some very major reductions. India has some extremely high tariffs. I think in a couple of cases they're 200% tariffs. So it could very well be the long-term end game will be closer to free trade than we've ever really been. But that's a thing that'll take some years to evolve. Near term, I think the question is, how disruptive will it be short term before Americans can expand the factories to overtake the production? And one of the ideas I had been championing was to combine tariffs with quotas and start out, take aluminum, for example. Almost half our aluminum comes from Canada. We don't have the domestic capacity to do 100% of it right now. So if we started with a quota system, and if you went over your quota, then you paid a tariff, that would moderate the amount of inflation that might come from the tariff, and yet it would be sufficiently encouraging to the American companies to build the factories to take up the supply. So it's possible they'll introduce that kind of a concept. But in many areas, the real question about inflation needs to be answered not just with the tariffs. I had argued that it would be sensible to first get the tax bill passed and then do tariffs, because the tax bill will offset quite a lot of the problems that we might have from tariffs, in that it lowers the corporate tax rate permanently. And the other things it will do is it will put lots of money into people's pockets that are going to spend it quickly. Making Social Security payments tax-free, those people are very high propensity to consume. They get more money, which they will if it goes through. They will spend it because they're living pretty close to that income anyway. So that will be powerful. Making overtime tax-free is also, I think, a very good idea, because while we're waiting to build plants to make up for the supply that we're cutting out, a quicker way to do it temporarily is with overtime. But nowadays, people don't like overtime so much. Maybe the added incentive of making it tax-free would help. And then finally, he wants to make tips to waiters tax-free. And that's also low-income bracket people. A lot of that money will get spent right away. So those would be factors that would offset. But what will offset anyway, and did last time when we put tariffs, what really happens, the country that's the exporter absorbs some portion of it. The exporter himself absorbs some. The importer absorbs some, and then some gets passed on. So these calculations about all these huge increases that you see in the paper now, those were the same papers that were forecasting that there'd be huge prices in cars and huge price increases in recreational boating and all kinds of things. And it never happened. There were some increases, but modest ones. And you notice Ford announced $2,000 a car, but only on certain lines of their cars. So it won't be $2,000 on all cars, it's just $2,000 on certain vehicles. So I think there will be some churning in the early months, maybe the first year or two, but I don't think it will be of cataclysmic proportions.
We have time for one more? One more question.
Secretary Ross, you said your mother was disappointed that you never became a lawyer, so I'm going to give you the opportunity to redeem yourself. On these tariffs, there are many lawyers, and there have been lawsuits filed that says Congress can only impose tariffs. Trump is doing it unilaterally. What's your view, as having been on the ground on this? Can Trump impose these tariffs unilaterally without Congress?
Okay. Well, during the first administration, one of the main reasons that we didn't go farther with tariffs than we did was we were groping for finding out how much power can the president actually exercise without going to Congress, because traditionally Congress has dominated the tariff picture. And so we brought in Section 301, Section 232 of some old laws, and then ultimately brought in one called IEPA. And those are all rooted in national security as the justification, or a crisis of some other sort as the justification. Now, in our case, they got tested. I was an individual defendant several times in the Supreme Court over them, and the steel tariffs especially were quite clearly upheld by the Supreme Court. So by the end of Trump 1.0, he had a pretty good idea what powers he really had. Now, whether what he's doing now is all fully justified by those arcane laws, we'll find out, because nowadays, if he announces anything, somebody sues him. So we know it will all be tested, and maybe some will get knocked out.
Thank you so much, Secretary Ross and Greg Lawson, for joining us at the City Club today. Forums like this one are made possible thanks to generous support from individuals like all of you. You can learn more about how to become a guardian of free speech at cityclub.org. Our forum today is part of our Authors in Conversation series, which we present in partnership with Cuyahoga Arts and Culture and the Cuyahoga County Public Library. We're very grateful for their partnership and support. Special thanks today to all of our friends at the Junaid Family Foundation for connecting us with Secretary Ross and helping us extend the invitation. Be sure to join the City Club on Friday, June 6th at the Mimi, Ohio Theater right here at Playhouse Square. We will be hosting the Right Honorable Dame Jacinda Ardern. She was the 40th Prime Minister of New Zealand. She'll be reflecting on the struggles, triumphs, and experiences that shaped her leadership style in her new memoir, A Different Kind of Power. Tickets are available for this forum and other forums at cityclub.org. You can also find our archives there as well. That brings us to the end of our program today. Again, thank you very much to Greg Lawson and Secretary Wilbur Ross. I'm Dan Malthrop. Our forum's now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
The ideas expressed in City Club forums are those of the speakers and not of the City Club of Cleveland, IdeaStream Public Media, or their sponsors. Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream Public Media are made possible by PNC and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.